Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. The US announced it will withdraw from the United Nations Scientific and Cultural Organization, accusing the body of anti-Israel bias. A US State Department spokesperson said on Thursday that the US would establish an observer mission to replace its representation at the Paris-based agency. In a statement announcing its withdrawal, Israel called the US administration's decision courageous and moral, and accused UNESCO of becoming a theatre of the absurd. Irina Bokova, the outgoing UNESCO head, called the US withdrawal a loss to multilateralism, saying she is convinced that UNESCO has never been so important for the US or the US for UNESCO. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the US's decision to exit UNESCO. Joining me on the program today are S.R. Tayal, former Secretary, Indian National Commission for UNESCO, Kamal Mitra Chinoy, Foreign Affairs expert, and P.M. Narayanan, Chief Producer, South Asia Bureau, German TV. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. What do you think of Trump's decision to exit UNESCO?
I think one can look at it from 3 points of view. One is whether UNESCO or the entire UN system is becoming irrelevant, so that countries can come in and walk out without really thinking of some loss to them or their interests. Second, does it reflect Trump's America First policy and his total disdain for multilateralism, and the very powerful influence of Israel and Israeli lobby on American foreign policy? And third, one can also look at the immediate provocations, that why this happened and what were the issues. Now, first I would say that UNESCO, the way it has been functioning for the last 20-25 years, the programs are now very few. Most of it is just conferences or advocacy or some kind of tripping here and there, and the real programs are not there. And there is a lot of criticism of UNESCO in every executive committee meeting, every governing board meeting, of bloated bureaucracy and total waste of money. So all that is there, and which has not been addressed very well. So that is one part. Trump, of course, has no use for UNESCO, and but it is not the first time that America has withdrawn. 1984, Ronald Reagan time it was withdrawn, because again somehow the organization has become very politicized. UNESCO's preamble says that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men and women that defenses of peace are to be constructed. But unfortunately, instead of uniting people, joining people, it has become an arena for political grandstanding and political formulations, and I think it is losing its purpose. And the third point, on this Palestinian issue, I would say that Haram al-Sharif or Temple Mount, they are not Palestinian heritage or Jewish heritage. They are world heritage. They are heritage of the entire mankind, and the whole thing should be reworded.
Okay. Professor, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. Like the ambassador has just pointed out, the UNESCO is a very inoffensive agency or organization, if you would like to call it that. So were you completely surprised with what the US has done as far as the UNESCO is concerned, or did you see this coming?
Well, first of all, I think that there is another factor added to what the ambassador has said, and that is that on a number of issues, President Trump has tried to demarcate himself away from the legacy of President Obama. Because after all, the allegations made by the United States could have been made at the same time when President Obama was there. So that is one. Secondly, the real problem is that a lot of the core funding for the UNESCO has gone down, and a lot of very important programs have not come in. Third thing is, what Israel is using against UNESCO is that it has not allowed the Jewish heritage, which for them rules all over Palestine, to be shown as Jewish, as holy to the Jewish people, and instead has been, as it were, taken away by Arab and Palestinian governments. Now, as the ambassador has pointed out, these are universal heritages. The last point, I'd say that the situation has now become quite grim in Israel because one of their Knesset members, Yehuda Glick, who's quite powerful, has actually warned the Palestinians that if they're not careful, the Al-Aqsa mosque might be destroyed. Now, that's a very holy shrine for all Muslims. So the situation really is a politicized situation where Israel has been able to now get out from an institution where it feels it is criticized too often, and the United States, for its own compulsions, has done the same.
You know, I want to talk about UNESCO and, you know, see what really the problem is as far as the UNESCO is concerned. Now, how big a blow is it on UNESCO and the work that UNESCO does as far as some of these World Heritage sites are concerned, the US pulling out of UNESCO?
Of course, it is a big blow for the UNESCO and the UN agencies because United States is one of the largest funders for this whole agencies. And that is, in fact, the power, the leverage in the hands of United States. Of course, they dictate the team for the game. But when come to the point, why this crisis now? It reflects the present crisis which is there across the world now. I mean, the fragmented identities, whose history? So this the whole the crisis started from there. The mosque is whose history it is my history or your history? And this is the crisis that is happening across the world. And US withdrawal in support of Israeli position is just a reflection of that. So but it will roll out for some more time, and of course United States is funding maximum, and they will have upper hand on this.
You know, as far as the funding issue is concerned, Ambassador, you know, you pointed out earlier as well in your opening statement, this is not the first time that UNESCO and the United States have run into troubled waters. It has happened in the past, a few decades ago. And even this time, you know, right from 2011,
Correct.
things haven't been great between the UNESCO and the United States. So it seemed like it was on the cards. I mean, the United States voting rights were cancelled in 2013, correct me if I'm wrong. And they seemed like an unofficial member. The only thing that has changed now is that Trump has made it official.
In 2011, UNESCO had recognized Palestine as a member state. And there is a US congressional resolution that if any UN body or international body accepts Palestine as a member, no funding can go from the United States. So Obama, so hands were bound. In 2011, so funding has not been there since 2011.
Yes.
It's the 6th year. So already there are $500 million of arrears. So, and their voting right has been suspended. So whether they remain observers or members, it makes no material difference. That is absolutely right. But that also shows that they have no real commitment in principle to UNESCO. And there was no way Trump would have paid $500 million given his mentality, his thinking. And again, I would say that the grip of Israel on American foreign policy is very, very strong. And we have also took advantage of it. Let me also say I was there in US when this deal with United States was being negotiated, the nuclear deal. So they are very friendly to us, but the fact remains that now, for instance, if you look at it in the context of Korea, whatever Trump is tweeting against North Korea is because in the context of Iran. And but another point I would like to make is that even Japan has a problem with UNESCO. Because China has managed to get the Nanjing massacre records included as historical records of the world.
Yes.
And Japan since last year has suspended its own contribution, which is almost about 35 million US dollars. So now what is happening, if the United States walks out, then Japan is, I think, the third largest or fourth largest, they also have a problem. Then all these organizations are ceding space to China. That is my immediate worry, that it may be a useless, ineffective organization, but it is an organization, it is a world organization, and it has soft power. So if America withdraws from Asia or from TPP or from trade and UNESCO and everywhere, what is happening? And ultimately only China will occupy this space unless Europe steps in.
You know, that's a very valid point that the ambassador has just made, Professor. I mean, there have been several voids that have been created ever since President Donald Trump took over as the President of the United States, be it free trade agreements, be it, several other organizations that he is talking about. We also know his critical stance as far as NATO is concerned. And it seems like everything is playing out into the hands of China. Is this something that we need to be wary about?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say, as far as Israel's power bloc is concerned, it's not only foreign policy where the Israelis are very powerful. Given the massive Zionist lobby in the United States itself, there, and including major newspapers and media in the United States, they have a lot of leverage. And what they have done is they have linked what they think are the failures of UNESCO to an attempt to minimize their religious and historic contribution to Palestine and other places. So they have touched a raw nerve, and therefore UNESCO has been attacked on that ground. Of course, it's very controversial. There are other Jews and other communities who don't agree with this, but they've brought in an historical issue and therefore question the political relevance of UNESCO. That's one. Secondly, about the Nanking massacre, the Japanese, of course, may not like it, but it's a historical fact, and it was a terrible massacre. Now, what does one do when you have people with this historical memory, where one is a relatively small though powerful country, and the second is heading towards being the second superpower of the world? Now, I think China would not want to or try very hard to rewrite history, but there should be what they were supposed to be, even from the time of the League of Nations, a kind of balancing instead of some major countries dominating the UN structure. And unfortunately, because of the idea of permanent Security Council members having a veto right and all that, India has argued before also that have more of a balance and let the smaller countries and other countries also have a say in the functioning of what is called the United Nations. But where are the United Nations? These are powerful nations, and I'm very scared that UNESCO may go the way of UNICEF, of WHO, if this kind of war over funding and political pressure goes on. So I think, as a number of observers have said over the last decade, there is time to rejig, to strengthen the UN system, because otherwise more and more of these issues will arise, more and more people will echo Israel and the United States, and then it might be very difficult to reform the system, as has been promised as an attempt for the last 15 years.
Sure, PM Narayanan, as far as blocks are concerned, it certainly seems like the Western blocks are dwindling when it comes to several of these organizations, and the non-Western blocks seem to be becoming a more dominant force in some of these organizations, forums, or whatever you may want to call them.
It's true. I mean, there are 93 countries in this United Nations system, but some countries are more equal than others. This is a fact. But I would like to take from Ambassador's point is that this United Nations is the byproduct of the Second World War, and it's evolved through the Cold War in later years, and it's not changed. I mean, that is the main problem. I mean, the mandate for UNESCO or UNICEF is not fulfilling. For example, what happened to our those Bamiyan Buddhas? This was a classic example. They could not do anything. I mean, the very question of why there is an organization like UNESCO if they cannot prevent such things happening in front of us. So such questions are very relevant these days, and that is one of the problems. And when this power comes to the people who are paying to that organization, then the situation gets worse. So that is what is happening now. And
yeah, Ambassador, do you somewhere see other countries following suit, going the United States way, and exiting from some of these organizations, because there is a large sum of money that these organizations, that these countries pay to these organizations to be members. So do you see that happening?
Not really. I think exit will be mostly on political considerations rather than on financial considerations, as we have seen America or Israel, maybe Japan, but I don't really think that Japan will withdraw. But ultimately, it is for UNESCO to try to make it more relevant to the members and try to rejig, as the professor said, the whole architecture has been of 1945 or the 40s, and the whole world has changed. New balancers have come up, but there is no hope, in my view, of any real change in the UN system as far as its decision making, etc., is concerned, whether it is UN Security Council or any other organization, UNESCO, etc. UNESCO, why this is happening? Because everybody has one vote, and for admission of Palestine, we also had voted in favor of admission of Palestine. I don't know whether today we'll vote for it or not, but at that time we had. But I would say that try to depoliticize the agenda and try to, it is after all UN education, scientific and cultural organization. So all the members should somehow be steered to keep away from political matters, and then the organization should adhere to its charter, its main purpose, and the political issue should be settled in Security Council, General Assembly. Everybody made very wild speeches in UN General Assembly recently. So let UNESCO concentrate on its core work. I think all the members together, the governing board, if they somehow try to learn this lesson from the threat of walk, or perhaps US will walk out, then the organization can be saved.
Sure. You know, Professor, as far as the Israel-Palestine issue is concerned, do you see UNESCO member states now going forward and, you know, upping the ante as far as Israel is concerned, needling them a little more maybe in the near future?
No, you know, I think number one, there is a problem in the discourse, because the Arab nations and other Muslim nations are badly fractured. There is no unity. Even in fighting IS, there are different positions by a number of countries. And also because of the economic factor and a new kind of political wind, if I may say so, which is not as progressive as it was in the 1960s and 70s. So in this kind of situation, they try desperately to maintain whatever purchase, whatever influence they have in the UN bodies, and try to make sure that these UN bodies don't collapse. But then the problem is that who is going to fund all this? Because obviously the United States, by withdrawing, is also giving a message that we are paying for things on which we don't have control, and therefore if you want these organizations to work, then you must listen to us, because we hold the purse strings. And I think other countries of the Western Bloc might also head in this direction. Therefore, it cannot be done without a reconfiguration, but the reconfiguration begs the question that how will it be done, how long will it take, and will it rock the boat so it will weaken the UN system as a whole. So the UN is now on increasingly on a razor's edge, how to have its programs of the UNESCO and such bodies without alienating powerful members. And there is going to be this give and take, because powerful members are going to try and get as much as they can. So the politicization of a nationalist sort in the UN has to be dealt with very carefully, because the UN itself may face damage if that's not done.
You know, I think we've established the fact that, you know, the politicization of some of these organizations needs to stop at the earliest, and some of these organizations need to reinvent themselves if they have to stay relevant in today's day and age. But do you suspect that a few years from now, some of these organizations, or for that matter, the UN itself, is not going to be relevant?
If they don't change themselves, of course, they will be redundant, because that's a need of the hour now. And of course, there is a huge scope for UNESCO kind of organization now, because we are living in a time this culturally so fragmented. And this is one organization which can bring in people, ideas, science, culture, everything. But it's very sad that such things happening for UNESCO. Reason is that it could not reform itself. So yes, it can be, if it doesn't reform itself in the coming years, yes, it can be redundant.
You You know, Ambassador, is this then a blessing in disguise? Would you call it that? Because, you know, at the end of the day, you yourself said in your opening statement that the UNESCO is a bloated organization. There's excessive spending as far as the UNESCO is concerned. So the funds are cut now. People are going to start living an austere life.
You know, one is the purpose and the other whether that organization has been able to deliver. Suppose a university does not deliver very well, we can't close down the university because the students have to be taught. So UNESCO, since it looks after education, if you really look at the world, the divisive tendencies are increasing. In many countries, the education curriculum syllabi are so poisonous. I think if UNESCO just concentrate, they had started a dialogue among civilizations some time back. I remember a decade back they had a culture of peace, the whole year was culture of peace. That is the direction they should concentrate on and make the organization relevant, and they should name and shame those countries where textbooks are poisonous and they are poisoning the minds of the young children. So what I will say, their objective is very, very pristine, very, very good and very, very topical. And they have not been able to work in that direction, and they are digressing with all Palestine and this kind of issues. So the whole executive board, members, director general have to bring it back to the core functions. And the biggest issue, after all, every intellectual is saying, is that liberalism is declining and orthodox, conservative, rightist, illiberal tendencies are coming up, and there UNESCO has a role to have a more open dialogue and promote a culture of peace through textbooks, through interactions, through conferences, and it will be appreciated by the world.
You know, a systemic change is required, Professor. Where is this change going to come from?
Look, first of all, about history textbooks. In India, this has been a very controversial matter for decades. And India, compared to many of the other countries of the global south, is more liberal than most of them. So this is not an easy thing to do, also because who will decide the parameters of history, or how history should be written? So I take the ambassador's point that this is important, but it's also extremely political. I can tell you with surety there are a lot of countries from the global south, including our own. If they don't like the way the textbooks are written, they will not associate with that program in the future. So I think the idea should be to head towards liberalism, but at a pace which people can accept. Because after all, there are many liberalisms. But I do agree with the ambassador that there should be an attempt to enrichen the kind of understanding people have about their own history and the related histories of other countries in the world. But it's an extremely complex task, and I think one way of dealing with it is also having experts from a number of those countries, so that the countries involved don't think, oh, this is partisan, but they are part of the process. If that is done, I think that would give UNESCO a new purchase in a very important part of theory and ideas, which are supposed anyway to move into the UN.
You know, time for quick closing comments from all my guests now, beginning with PM Narayanan. You know, what's the way forward, really?
Way forward is to change the institution. I mean, there is a scope for this institution because we are divided across culture and caste and different identities. So there is definitely a scope for this institution, but it has to change. And also, it should be more democratic. Of course, the United States have got more power inside the system because they pay more to the organization, but the organization has to have the capacity to restructure itself and take it forward.
Ambassador, your closing comments on the program.
UNESCO is relevant. It has a very important function, and exit of United States may shock the members to come to some kind of relook the way they are functioning, and maybe it may be good for the organization.
Professor, close the show for us with your closing comments.
I think that it is time a number of organizations of the UN relook, rethink, because it should not be just that UNESCO is being targeted, because there are other organizations like UNICEF, WHO and so forth, which will also need to go through a modernizing process. And I think if the UN buckles down and their members agree largely on this, then there can be a move forward for these institutions and a greater relevance that they have, which should leave a lot of critics now more satisfied then than they are now.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank my guests, S.R. Tayal, Kamal Mitra Chinoy and PM Narayanan for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.